Today we're about to discover a love story pushed to its absolute limit, when one cruel ultimatum forces Diep to sell an entire region's sweet potato stock in just 72 hours, or lose James forever. But the real question is, can love survive when dignity, sacrifice, and survival are all on the line? Beneath the old wooden porch, late afternoon sunlight spilled like warm honey across Diep's narrow shoulders. Everything around her felt simple, almost fragile. The faded planks, the clay stove still glowing from the morning fire, the soft rustle of vegetables piled in baskets by the steps. And yet, in that humble place, there was a kind of peace James had never found in all his years of luxury. Not long ago, James was the kind of man people only saw through polished office glass, an untouchable CEO in tailored silk, a man whose signature could move millions in a single afternoon. But now, under that weathered roof, in a cheap white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, he looked like someone else. His fingers, once used to pens and contracts, were carefully stripping bamboo ties so Diep could bundle the greens faster. The air carried the sharp scent of wood smoke mixed with the comforting aroma of fresh rice. James glanced at Diep, and none of that cool corporate sharpness remained. In its place was something quieter, deeper, an openness that only came when he was with her. I honestly never imagined starting a fire would be harder than signing $1 million contract, he said with a soft laugh. His soot-stained hand reached over and tucked a loose strand of hair behind Diep's ear. The gesture was so natural, so gentle, it made her pause. Then she smiled, and for a moment, light broke through the endless worries she carried every day. Dinner was nothing special. Just a bowl of instant noodles stretched with wild greens picked from the edge of the fields. No polished table, no expensive wine. But to James, sitting beside Diep and sharing that steaming bowl under the fading sky, it felt richer than any banquet he had ever attended. For the first time in years, he wasn't eating to impress anyone. He wasn't performing power, he was simply present. Free. Across the yard, little Nye chased a paper pinwheel spinning wildly in the breeze. Her laughter rang bright and unguarded against the fence and the patch of earth behind the house. The child had known abandonment too early, yet somehow she still laughed as if the world had never hurt her. That sound softened the jagged places in both of them. It made the poor little house feel whole. For a brief moment, it almost seemed like life had stopped testing them. Then came the sound. A car screeched to a halt outside, sharp and violent, tearing through the quiet like a blade. Diep's smile vanished. James turned toward the road, his expression hardening. Dust rose behind the vehicle as the door opened. Mr. Hahn stepped out. He didn't need to raise his voice to dominate the space. His presence alone carried pressure. He stood there in cold precision, immaculate, controlled, merciless. He looked completely out of place against the mud yard and rough wooden house, and maybe that was the point. He had come not just to visit, but to remind them exactly where they stood. This time, he didn't throw money at Diep like she was someone who could be bought and dismissed. What he threw was worse, an ultimatum. The entire region's sweet potato supply had stalled. Warehouses were overflowing, produce was beginning to rot, and the wood factory's capital was locked inside the loss. If Diep could not sell all of it within 72 hours and recover the money, she would have to sign a paper agreeing to leave James forever. There was no softness in the way he said it. "You say you love him?" Mr. Hoan's eyes locked onto Diep with brutal calm. "Then prove you're not just a burden feeding off his life." His words struck harder than any slap. They were aimed straight at her pride, her poverty, her place in the world. Each syllable felt like a blade pressing into the part of her that had survived humiliation in silence for years. Diep stood frozen. In her mind, she could already see the warehouse, the endless piles of sweet potatoes stacked in damp corners, the air thick with spoilage, the weight of impossible numbers pressing on her chest. She looked at her own hands, rough and worn from labor, fingers scarred by work that never seemed enough to lift her out of hardship. Then she looked at James. He had once had everything: status, wealth, influence, a future shaped by privilege. Now, because of her and because he refused to walk away, he had been stripped of every resource his father could control. Mr. Hahn saw that, and worse, he enjoyed it. The faint curve of his mouth wasn't just contempt, It was class humiliation turned into spectacle. In his eyes, this was never simply about sweet potatoes or factory losses. It was a test designed to crush Diep where she was weakest. He wanted her to understand that love, in his world, was a privilege people like her had no right to claim. The silence that followed felt unbearably heavy, but James didn't argue. He didn't plead. He simply stepped forward until he was standing beside Diep, close enough that his shoulder nearly touched hers. And somehow that small movement said everything. Before the sun had fully set, both of them understood one terrifying truth. The next 72 hours would change everything. James didn't waste a second complaining. The moment Mr. Hahn's car disappeared down the dirt road, he turned back, pulled off his white shirt, and tossed it onto the porch rail. The former young master, once surrounded by chauffeurs and assistants, now stood in the humid evening air, with mud already clinging to his trousers and resolve burning in his eyes. Diep had no time left for shock. Fear still pressed against her chest, but something stronger rose faster, the instinct to move. She rushed with James to the warehouse, and when they pushed open the swollen wooden doors, the full scale of the disaster hit them. Mountains of sweet potatoes filled the dim space from wall to wall. The damp air smelled of soil, mildew, and the first signs of rot. For one brief moment, Diep froze. Then James's voice cut through the panic. "We don't need perfect conditions," he said. "We need speed, strategy, and stamina." That snapped her back. While James organized transport, labor, and sorting, Diep grabbed an old phone and began building sales channels through the night. She posted online, called market vendors, messaged grocery owners, and contacted every buyer she could find. When they realized fresh produce alone would never move fast enough, she adjusted immediately. The best sweet potatoes were packed for sale, while the smaller ones were sliced, dried, and turned into snacks to buy time. Outside, the rain came hard. Past midnight, the storm hammered the warehouse roof while James worked without pause, carrying sack after sack onto waiting trucks. This was a man who had once lived at the peak of wealth, yet now he bent his back under real weight, hands raw, muscles shaking, clothes soaked with rain and mud. There was no pride left in luxury, only devotion. Diep worked beside him until her fingers went numb. She stopped crying because there was no room for tears. Every hour mattered, every sack mattered, every phone call mattered. By the second night, both of them looked like they had been fighting a war no one else could see. Then the sabotage came. John's men arrived before dawn, pretending to be passing laborers, but James caught the danger in their movements. When one of them lunged toward the packed crates, James stepped in front of Diep and took the blow meant to destroy everything. The impact slammed him against the truck. Diep heard the hit before she heard herself scream. James dropped to one knee, blood spreading across his shoulder, but he forced himself up again, placing his body between Diep and the men like a shield. "Touch her work again," he said through clenched teeth, "and you answer to me." Something in his eyes made them stop. Not the polished threat of a CEO. Something harder. A man who had already lost everything material and had nothing left to fear. The men backed off and vanished into the rain. Diep ran to James, her hands shaking as she pressed cloth against the wound. Blood soaked through instantly. Her vision blurred, but James caught her wrist. "Even if I lose everything," he whispered, "I will still protect your dignity." By the third morning, the sky cleared. Diep stood in the warehouse doorway, staring at the impossible. It was empty, no rotting piles, no unsold stock, just bare floorboards, scattered mud, and the final receipts trembling in her hand. When Mr. Hahn arrived, expecting defeat, Diep walked straight to him and placed the ledger and recovered funds in his hands. Her face was pale with exhaustion, but her gaze was steady. The timid girl he had humiliated was gone. In her place stood a woman who had discovered her own strength in the middle of the storm. Mr. Hahn said nothing. He looked from the ledger to Diep, then to James beside her, injured, muddy, drained, yet proud. For the first time, he lowered his head slightly. No speech, just a small nod that felt like a late apology. James pulled Diep into his arms in the middle of the field where new sprouts were beginning to rise. And there, in the quiet light of dawn, they both understood. Love is not about finding someone to lean on. It is about finding someone who helps you become stronger in the storm.
Không còn thời gian do dự, cô cùng James lao vào cuộc chiến với thời gian. Trong nhà kho ẩm ướt chất đầy nông sản sắp hỏng, James tổ chức vận chuyển và phân loại, còn Diep tìm mọi cách bán hàng qua chợ, cửa hàng và mạng. Họ làm việc suốt đêm mưa gió, biến khoai thành nhiều sản phẩm để kịp tiêu thụ. Khi Joe sai người đến phá hoại, James lại liều mình bảo vệ Diep dù bị thương nhưng vẫn đứt trắng khô. Sau 3 ngày kiệt sức, điều kỳ diệu xảy ra, kho hàng trống rỗng, toàn bộ khoai đã được bán hết. Khi ông Hoàng đến, Diep bình tĩnh trao sổ sách và thu tiền về. Lần đầu tiên ông lặng lẽ thừa nhận sức mạnh của tình yêu và nghị lực.